Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his short brown hair. He glanced down at his muscular frame, developed from years of working out at the gym. How could this be possible? He'd lived his entire life as a man, never questioning his gender identity. Now, at 35 years old, his whole world had been turned upside down. "Hey, Mark, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Cindy's voice snapped him out of his daze. His colleague stood by his desk, concern etched on her face. Her long blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore a crisp white blouse tucked into a navy pencil skirt. Yeah, I'm fine," Mark stammered, quickly minimizing the email. "Just some surprising news from the doctor." Cindy's brow furrowed. "Nothing serious, I hope?" Mark forced a smile. No, nothing to worry about. Thanks for asking, though." As Cindy walked away, Mark couldn't help but notice the sway of her hips, the gentle curve of her waist. He'd always found her attractive, but now he felt a different kind of pull, a mix of admiration and envy? Throughout the day, Mark struggled to focus on his work. His mind kept drifting back to the email, to what it might mean for his life. During his lunch break, he found himself in a secluded corner of the office courtyard, furiously Googling information about XX chromosomes in men. He learned that, while rare, it was possible for individuals with XX chromosomes to develop as males due to the presence of the SRY gene, which typically resides on the Y chromosome but can sometimes be found on an X chromosome. This condition, called XX male syndrome, affected about 1 in 20,000 individuals assigned male at birth. Mark's head spun with the information. He'd never felt particularly masculine or feminine. He was just himself. But now, armed with this knowledge, he began to question everything. Had he always subconsciously known he was different? Was this why he'd never quite fit in with the bros at work, preferring the company of his female colleagues? As the week progressed, Mark found himself hyper-aware of every interaction, every feeling. He caught himself admiring women's clothing in shop windows, wondering how the fabrics would feel against his skin. When he went to the gym, he felt a strange disconnect from the other men in the locker room, as if he were an imposter in their midst. At work, he found himself gravitating more towards Cindy. They'd always been friendly, but now he felt a deep connection to her. He admired the way she carried herself, the confidence in her voice during meetings. Was this attraction or a desire to be like her? On Friday afternoon, as the office began to empty for the weekend, Cindy approached Mark's desk again. "Hey, a bunch of us are going for drinks at O'Malley's. Want to join?" Mark hesitated. Normally, he'd decline, preferring to hit the gym or spend a quiet night at home. But something in him yearned for connection, for understanding. "Sure," he heard himself say. "I'd like that." O'Malley's was packed with the after-work crowd, the air thick with the smell of beer and fried food. Mark found himself wedged into a booth between Cindy and another colleague, Tom. As conversation flowed around him, Mark's mind wandered. He watched Cindy laugh at a joke, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the elegant arch of her neck as she threw her head back. A wave of emotion washed over him, longing, confusion, a deep-seated ache he couldn't quite place. "Earth to Mark." Tom's voice broke through his reverie. "You with us, buddy?" Mark blinked, realizing he'd been staring. "Sorry, just lost in thought." Cindy touched his arm gently. "Are you sure you're okay? You've seemed distracted all week." The concern in her eyes nearly undid him. Mark took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I found out I have XX chromosomes." The table fell silent. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he awaited their reactions. Tom was the first to speak. "Wait, like female chromosomes, but you're a dude?" Mark winced at the bluntness of the question. "It's complicated. There's this thing called XX male syndrome." "Oh, I've heard of that," Cindy interrupted, her eyes lighting up with interest. "It's fascinating, isn't it?" The intricacies of human genetics never cease to amaze me." Mark felt a rush of gratitude for her understanding response. As he explained what he'd learned about his condition, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. His colleagues listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and offering words of support. As the night wore on, the group dwindled until only Mark and Cindy remained. They moved to the bar, nursing their drinks in comfortable silence. "How are you really feeling about all this?" Cindy asked softly. Mark stared into his glass, swirling the amber liquid. "Honestly, I'm not sure. It's like everything I thought I knew about myself has been called into question. I look in the mirror and I don't know who I'm seeing anymore." Cindy nodded, her eyes full of empathy. "Gender identity is complex. It's not just about chromosomes or body parts. It's about how you feel inside." "That's the thing," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure how I feel inside anymore. I've always been comfortable as a man, but now I find myself wondering what it would be like to be a woman, to wear dresses, to feel soft and feminine. Is that crazy?" Cindy placed her hand over his. "It's not crazy at all. Gender is a spectrum, and it's okay to explore where you fall on that spectrum. Have you considered talking to a therapist who specializes in gender identity issues?" Mark shook his head. "I hadn't thought of that. Do you really think it would help?" "I do," Cindy smiled. "And for what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave for being so open about this. Whatever you discover about yourself, know that you have friends who support you." As they left the bar, Mark felt a mix of emotions: fear, excitement, gratitude. The cool night air felt refreshing on his skin as they walked towards the subway station. "Thanks for listening," Mark said as they reached the entrance. "It means more than you know." Cindy pulled him into a hug. "Anytime. And Mark, remember, you're still you. Chromosomes don't define who you are as a person." As Mark rode the subway home, Cindy's words echoed in his mind. Who was he, really? For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to truly contemplate the question. Over the next few weeks, Mark threw himself into research. He read countless articles and forum posts about gender identity, watched documentaries about transgender experiences, and even attended a support group for individuals questioning their gender. At work, he found himself paying more attention to the women around him, not just in terms of attraction, but studying their mannerisms, their clothing choices, the way they interacted with others. He began to notice subtle differences in how people treated men and women in the office, things he'd never picked up on before. One evening, after a particularly emotional support group meeting, Mark stood in front of his bedroom mirror. He'd purchased a flowy blouse and a skirt from an online store, having them delivered to a nearby Amazon locker to avoid questions from neighbors. With trembling hands, he slipped the blouse over his head. The fabric felt cool and soft against his skin. He stepped into the skirt, zipping it up at the side. Taking a deep breath, he looked at his reflection. The clothes hung awkwardly on his muscular frame, but something about the image in the mirror made his heart race. For a moment, he could see a glimpse of who he might be if he embraced this side of himself. Tears welled up in his eyes as a mix of emotions washed over him. Fear, excitement, confusion, and a strange sense of homecoming. He twirled slowly, watching the skirt flare out around his legs. A knock at the door made him jump. "Mark, it's Cindy. You said I could drop by to pick up those reports?" Mark's heart leapt into his throat. He'd completely forgotten he'd told Cindy to stop by. "Just a minute," he called out, his voice cracking. He rushed to change back into his regular clothes, stuffing the blouse and skirt into the back of his closet. His hands shook as he smoothed down his hair and took a few deep breaths to compose himself. When he opened the door, Cindy's smile faltered. "Are you okay? Your eyes are red." Mark hesitated, then made a decision. "Actually, can you come in for a minute? There's something I want to show you." Cindy followed him into the apartment, curiosity evident on her face. Mark led her to the bedroom, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. I've been exploring some things," he said softly, reaching into the closet to pull out the blouse and skirt. "I'm not sure what it means yet, but I wanted to share this with someone, with you." Cindy's eyes widened in understanding. She reached out to touch the fabric of the blouse, a soft smile playing on her lips. "It's beautiful, Mark. Have you tried them on?" Mark nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I was wearing them when you knocked, actually. Would you want to show me?" Mark's head snapped up, searching Cindy's face for any sign of judgment or disgust. He found only warmth and acceptance. "You don't think it's weird?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cindy shook her head. "Not at all. I think it's brave of you to explore this part of yourself, and I'm honored that you trust me enough to share it with me." Encouraged by her words, Mark changed back into the blouse and skirt. When he emerged from the bathroom, Cindy's face lit up. "You look wonderful," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "How does it feel?" Mark smoothed his hands down the front of the skirt. "It feels right somehow, like I'm seeing a part of myself I've kept hidden for a long time." Cindy stepped closer, adjusting the collar of the blouse. "You know, with a little styling, we could really make this work. Would you like me to help you with makeup sometime?" Mark's eyes widened. "You'd do that for me?" "Of course," Cindy smiled. "That's what friends are for." As the weeks passed, Mark's exploration of his gender identity deepened. With Cindy's help, he learned to apply makeup, style his growing hair, and walk in heels. They would spend evenings at his apartment, laughing as he tottered around in stilettos or debated the merits of different eyeshadow colors. At work, Mark began to make subtle changes. He grew out his nails, started using more neutral-scented body products, and incorporated more androgynous pieces into his wardrobe. Some colleagues noticed, raising eyebrows or whispering behind his back, but Mark found he cared less and less about their opinions. His relationship with Cindy also evolved. What had started as friendship and mentorship began to blur into something more. Mark found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't quite define. Was it attraction, admiration, or a desire to be like her? One Friday night, after a particularly successful makeover session, Mark and Cindy sat on his couch, a bottle of wine between them. Mark wore a simple black dress that hugged his curves, softened somewhat by the hormone therapy he'd recently started, his face beautifully made up. "You know," Cindy said, her cheeks flushed from the wine, "you make a gorgeous woman." Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "Thank you. I think I'm starting to feel like one too, or at least like someone in between." Cindy leaned closer, her eyes sparkling. "Can I ask you something personal?" Mark nodded, his heart rate quickening. "Are you attracted to men or women? Or both? I've been curious." Mark took a sip of wine, considering the question. "Honestly, I'm not sure anymore. I've always been attracted to women, but lately I find myself noticing men in a way I never did before. And then there's you." He trailed off, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting. Cindy's hand rested on his knee, her touch sending sparks through his body. "Me?" Cindy whispered, her face inches from his. Before he could second-guess himself, Mark closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to hers. Cindy responded immediately, her hand coming up to cup his face. The kiss was soft, exploratory. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. "Wow," Cindy murmured. "That was—" "I'm sorry," Mark said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" Cindy silenced him with a hug. When they finally separated, she rested her forehead against his. "Don't apologize," she said softly. "I've wanted to do that for a while now." They spent the rest of the night talking, as the sun began to rise, casting a soft glow through the windows. Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. A week later, Mark sat in his doctor's office, fidgeting nervously with the hem of his shirt. He'd come in for a follow-up appointment to discuss his hormone therapy options. The doctor entered, a puzzled expression on her face. "Mr. Johnson, I'm not quite sure how to say this, but there seems to have been a mix-up with your initial test results." Mark's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" The doctor sighed, looking genuinely apologetic. "We ran your genetic tests again, and it appears that you actually have XY chromosomes, typically associated with biological males. The XX result was an error in our lab." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mark gripped the arms of his chair, trying to process this information. "But how is that possible? I've been taking hormones, I've been living as... I don't understand." The doctor leaned forward, her voice gentle. "I'm so sorry for this mistake. I can only imagine how confusing and distressing this must be for you. Would you like me to refer you to a therapist who specializes in gender identity issues? They might be able to help you work through this." Mark nodded numbly, barely hearing the rest of what the doctor said. His mind was reeling. Who was he now? After months of exploring his feminine side, of feeling like he'd finally found his true self, was he supposed to just go back to living as a man? He left the doctor's office in a daze, wandering aimlessly through the city streets. Without consciously deciding to, he found himself outside Cindy's apartment building. He pressed the buzzer for her unit. "Hello!" Her voice crackled through the intercom. "Cindy, it's me. Can I come up? I really need to talk to someone." Moments later, he was in her apartment, collapsing onto her couch as the emotions he'd been holding back finally broke free. Through his tears, he explained what the doctor had told him. Cindy listened patiently, holding his hand and offering tissues. When he finished, she pulled him into a tight hug. "Oh, Mark," she said softly. "I'm so sorry you're going through this. But you know what? This doesn't change who you are inside." Mark pulled back, wiping his eyes. "Doesn't it, though? I thought I was, discovering my true self. But it was all based on a lie?" Cindy shook her head firmly. "No, it wasn't. Mark, gender isn't just about chromosomes or body parts. It's about how you feel inside. These past few months, you've been happier and more authentic than I've ever seen you. That wasn't because of some test result. It was because you allowed yourself to explore a side of yourself you'd kept hidden." Mark considered her words. "But what if I was just playing a role, trying to be something I'm not?" "Do you really believe that?" Cindy asked gently. "When you wear a dress, when you put on makeup, does it feel like you're pretending, or does it feel like you're expressing a genuine part of yourself?" Mark closed his eyes, thinking back to all the moments of joy and self-discovery he'd experienced. The first time he'd seen himself fully made up in the mirror, the freedom he'd felt twirling in a skirt, the sense of rightness when Cindy had called him beautiful. "It feels real," he whispered. "It feels like me." Cindy squeezed his hand. "Then that's what matters. You don't need a specific set of chromosomes to validate your gender identity. You get to define who you are." As her words sank in, Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He looked at Cindy, marveling at her wisdom and acceptance. "What did I do to deserve you?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Cindy smiled. "You were yourself. That's more than enough." In the weeks that followed, Mark continued to explore his gender identity, but with a new perspective. He realized that the journey he'd embarked on wasn't about becoming a woman or rejecting his masculinity. It was about embracing all aspects of himself, about finding a way to express his gender that felt authentic and comfortable. He began to identify as non-binary, using both he, him, and they, them pronouns. Some days he wore suits to work, other days he wore blouses and slacks. He kept his hair long, but styled it in various ways depending on his mood. His colleagues, for the most part, were supportive. There were a few who didn't understand, who made insensitive comments or avoided him altogether. But Mark found he had the strength to face their judgment, secure in the knowledge that he was living his truth. His relationship with Cindy deepened, evolving into a partnership built on mutual respect, understanding, and love. She stood by him through every step of his journey, offering support without trying to influence his choices. 1 year after that fateful day in the doctor's office, Mark stood in front of the mirror in their shared apartment. He wore a flowing maxi dress in a deep blue that brought out his eyes, offset by a tailored blazer that accentuated his broad shoulders. His shoulder-length hair was styled in loose waves, and subtle makeup enhanced his features. Cindy appeared behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist.
"Ready for the gala?"
Mark nodded, a smile playing on his lips.
"Ready as I'll ever be."
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.